Kia ora, Markie here. So welcome to the channel. Markie, the Demystified and Retroactive Jealousy support. This isn't a video about retroactive jealousy, but it is about demystifying. Okay, so a couple of things to demystify this channel. First of all, if you're new, is that this channel is rough and ready. We shoot videos on the hoof, and that tends to mean we have the camera the one way around because it's easier to hold it. I'll use an iPhone. It's easier to just do things in the moment, and holding it this way around means I usually get kind of thumbs all over and kind of like that, and it's not good really. That's the kind of thing. So it's not the most professional, it's not the most slick. We're not slick or stylish on this channel. It's all about content and immediacy and passion. So there we go. Okay, and passion, I guess, is a big part of today's subject. So I want to talk about sex addiction and porn addiction. Now, they're both subjects I've talked about before, but I've never sought to do a video explaining the difference. Is there a difference, Markie? Isn't it all part of the same kettle of fish? Well, no, but it is quite complex. Okay. So what might be easier is to change, maybe alter the terminology a little bit and talk about sex addiction versus porn dependency. Okay. And the reason for that will hopefully become apparent as we go along. So sex addiction is something which is out of vogue at the moment in the psychological community. Current diagnostic manuals don't have sex addiction in there as a diagnosis, and it's often something that people are sniffy about. A lot of people say sex addiction doesn't exist. So I think they talk about hypersexual disorder or something like that. I make no bones about it. I think that's complete nonsense. Sex addiction is very real. I've worked with a number of sex addicts. There are 12-step groups that work with sex addicts, such as Sex Addicts Anonymous. There's a number of them actually, variants. So there's Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. I think there's about 3 or 4 different 12-step groups that work with sex addiction. If you're interested in 12-step groups, I've done a series of videos on that. So have a look at those if that doesn't mean anything to you. But 12-step group is like AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, and all the groups that followed in the wake of AA using the same or an adaptive model. So sex addiction is very real, and if you want some academic sources to support that, I can give you those. But I think people tend to think that the psychiatry and the field of psychology, there's some kind of orthodoxy. There's some kind of somebody at the top that kind of says this is what we believe, and this is what we don't believe. This is the dogma, and it's not as rigid as that. It's much more fluid. What we have is diagnostic manuals. And there are 2 main ones that are used in the world, and they list, they're revised on a regular basis. So if you look in the current edition of these diagnostic manuals, they will tell you what diagnoses are in fashion, and it is a bit like a fashion, I think, in some ways, at this particular point. And that will change. It can change like the wind. One edition can change to another. So I used to kind of, hold great store in all these things and think, no, that's the name of this condition, and you shouldn't call it something else, and if it's not in there, then it's obviously not a valid thing. But that's kind of nonsense, really. I think you have to take these diagnostic manuals as an indication of what current thinking is, and nothing more. And sometimes current thinking is wrong. In fact, very often current thinking is wrong. So there's a lot of great things and great research that's gone into these manuals. So I'm not dissing them. I'm not saying we should throw them away. They can be very useful. But there's all sorts of debates around the diagnostic manuals. So sex addiction generally. So I'm going against the kind of the majority of the psychiatric and psychological community by saying that sex addiction is a thing, but there's also plenty of people that would agree with me, including kind of sex addicts and recovered sex addicts. So sex addiction is something that I would say has always been with us. Now, people say funny things about sex addiction. They say, oh, sex addiction, chance to be a fine thing. They think sex addiction is about people that just have a lot of sex. But but addiction, doing a lot of something, does not make an addiction. Okay, I'm very fond of breathing. I do it all the time, but I'm not a breathing addict. Okay, so addiction by its very nature has to be something that has negative consequences, and breathing has generally been quite good for me so far. I'm not thinking about giving up breathing. My relationship with breathing is a very healthy one, and I won't give up breathing till the day I die. So it's not about doing a lot of stuff. It's about compulsions. It's about you don't feel okay unless you get your fix of whatever the addiction happens to be. So sex addiction tends not to be somebody in a monogamous relationship that just likes to get between the sheets a lot. It tends to be somebody that's often the focus is on pornography, often the focus is on using sex workers, often it's on harmful behaviours or high risk behaviours, often it's sex lines, and somebody who's a sex addict will probably be bankrupting themselves, maybe putting themselves at risk of sexually transmitted diseases, maybe having serial affairs, maybe causing great harm to the people around them, and they're not going to be happy bunnies. Okay, they're not people that are having a great, we're not talking about people that have a lifestyle choice of having a lot of sex. We're talking about people that feel empty inside, and are constantly trying to seek fulfillment through some kind of sexual stimulation. And it kind of makes sense. It makes a lot of sense, because if you think about how we evolved as human beings and how our brains work, the satisfaction of primal urges is far more compelling to us than anything else. Okay, so the part of our brain that tells us that we need to eat, there's a part of our brain that tells us that we need sex, can be immensely, far more powerful than the parts of our brain that are rational and logical and can do maths and poetry. So out of all the addictions, it just, to me, it seems kind of totally intuitive, really. It just kind of makes sense that sex would be an addictive process. So sex addiction has always been around, and sex addiction is, as long as there's been pornography, sex addiction has revolved as often focused on pornography. That's often been what sex addicts focus on. Porn dependency, I call it, is something slightly different, and it's new. Okay, because what we're talking about here is modern high-speed internet porn. Okay, so this only came about, I think, from 2007. Now, it's not to say that people didn't have problems with pornography before, but they would fit into the, generally speaking, let's use a shaky camera, generally speaking, would come into the sex addict category. Since high-speed internet, and since the availability, particularly of free, multitudes, bounteous kind of amounts, an infinity, an abundance of pornography in the form of pictures and videos has suddenly, at that point, suddenly became available, and it has a specific and distinct effect upon the brain. Okay, so what we've found is that people that use a lot of high-speed pornography, their brain structure actually changes. It's something that can be measured. Okay, and I've talked about this in other videos, but the emphasis has been slightly different. Okay, so I'll put links to some of the other videos that I've done on this topic when I'm able to edit this. I'm not able to edit stuff for a little while at the moment, so if it's not there, just be patient and it will be there. So, or send me a message and remind me. So really, it's blowing people's brains, modern pornography. So what it is the speed of it and the amount of images that a user can look at in a period of time. Okay, it's it's kind of there was a Judge Dredd. This is to show my nerdy credentials here. There was a Judge Dredd series where this kind of sweet little guy called Uncle Umpty, I think he was called, created some sweets that were the nicest sweets that had ever been invented, and people just became addicted to them, and in the end he got sort of sent off to a penal colony on a foreign planet, on a distant planet, for making these sweets, you know, bless his little heart. And it's kind of like that, really. Modern pornography stimulates the brain, stimulates people sexually more than they've ever been sexually stimulated before, and it's to do with the amount of images that you can look at in the amount of time, like I said. So what is happening is it's changing people's brains, and this is all the research on this is around guys. So I'm going to talk about guys. I'm not sure what the differences might be with women that are high porn users. Tend to be as common that women are you know, high-end kind of porn users. It's not kind of, women do use porn. It's a bit of a myth that they don't, but most of the evidence that we've got is about guys, so I'm going to talk about guys. So their brains change, and what happens as well is that normal sex with a partner, male, female, whatever, will not arouse them because it can't compete with the abundance of, you know, images on the internet. So what happens is, you know, sometimes quite young guys growing up, you know, more or less getting weaned onto porn from a very, can you get weaned onto things, or you don't want to get weaned off things? Yeah. Getting, or certainly kind of, you know, becoming users of porn from quite an early age. And then the access as people get older gets easier and easier, particularly as, you know, people become adult and live independently and have more privacy. So the effect it's having is first of all no arousal, and what this means is sexual dysfunction, erectile dysfunction. So these young guys, you know, their first introduction to sexual arousal is through porn. They use a lot of porn. They want to get a girlfriend. They get a girlfriend. They get into bed, and nothing happens. And that's pretty devastating for guys. So that's one effect. The other effect is wanting more and more porn, and getting triggered, becoming more easily triggered towards porn. So kind of associating maybe things like, you know, a computer keyboard with sexual arousal. You know, there'll become a kind of a link there. You know, rather than be aroused by, you know, a beautiful, you know, man or woman walking along the road, they become aroused by a keyboard or the sound of a computer booting up or something like that. And the other thing, which is really, you know, scary, it's all scary really. The other thing is that people will would derive less pleasure from everyday things, from anything else other than internet porn. The pleasure that people would have naturally and normally got from looking at a sunset, eating ice cream, having good times with friends, going for a walk, sport, whatever it might be, is lowered. The amount of, you know, positive. I'm not sure of the chemistry of it exactly, but basically you know, the levels of pleasure are just reduced. So everything apart from porn can become flat. So that's kind of pretty scary, isn't it? So what's the answer? Well, complete abstinence is the answer for quite some time. And then what tends to happen is these guys regain their kind of ability to be aroused and have sex with a partner. And, you know, their general kind of sense of pleasure in life increases. It's damn hard for them to get off it. You know, and I think these things are really hard. People tend to do these things on their own. They don't realise that there is help around. But yeah, they have to be off it for quite quite some time. I think I've got the figure 4 months in my head, but I might be making that up or misremembering that. I can give you links to some of the research that this stuff comes from. So what they found though is that older guys recover far more quickly, which is kind of interesting. But the reason we think they recover more quickly is because they predate the internet. So their formative kind of sexual experiences and sexual level of arousal were very different. So they recover more quickly, even if they've been using the pornography a lot. The worst thing you can do really is to just cut down a bit. Funnily enough, you'd think that would help, but actually, and again, I'll put some links to the sources of this. If you were to say cut down, from heavy use and getting all the symptoms of pornography dependency, you were to cut down to once a fortnight, that would actually make it worse. And this is to do with the kind of brain process where a kind of healing process kind of actually reinforces the changes in the brain rather than rewires the brain. If you stop completely, the brain rewires. But if you do it only once in a while, it reinforces those patterns in the brain. So scary stuff, really scary. Now, so I've talked about this before in a series of videos that I've done about the threats of porn to children, where I just touched on some of these issues for adults. So this is more about adults, but also, like I say, about the difference between sex addiction and porn addiction. So if you find yourself dependent upon pornography, emotionally dependent on it, and you have the kind of symptoms that I described, then that's pretty likely to be a porn dependency. But how do you know that you are not a sex addict? And this is the tricky thing, really. So some porn dependent people will be sex addicts and some won't. Okay, if you're a sex addict, you're likely to be porn dependent, but again, not necessarily, because your outlet might be different. So some sex addicts are very, everyone's got their MO, really. Whoops, sorry. As I warned you about this channel, everybody's got their so every sex addict would be different. So some sex addicts are kind of, they're sexual predators. They pick up, they become, their interest is pick up, and they will be wanting to seduce people. They will be wanting to, go out and score. It's interesting we use the same word, score, for getting drugs. And some will be into perhaps club scene or something like that, and or some will be into sort of involved in a very sort of specific and particular fetish, and some will be porn addicts as well, but not all of them. I think some of the old outlets, I don't know. This isn't something that I've kind of, it's difficult to get data on this kind of thing, but I don't know, what the use of sex lines is like at the moment since the internet came along. That used to be quite a big thing, didn't it? People using sex lines and racking up huge bills and things like that with sex lines. And also kind of abusive behaviours can commit. So not every sex addict is a sex offender, and not every sex offender is a sex addict. They're often there's all kind of like overlapping Venn diagrams, really. But some sex addicts get into offending behaviours, stalking, peeping, stealing underwear, all kinds of things. So I hope that has demystified it, even though much as we try to demystify it, it is quite a complex and confused area. So I think Venn diagrams is the best way to kind of look at it. Is that some people who are dependent on pornography will be sex addicts, and some won't. So you've got that intersection of those two circles, and then you've got another circle which might be sex offending, another circle which might be harmful sexual behaviours to the user, like high risk behaviours. Some would be predatory sexual behaviours, and some wouldn't be. Some would be very much solo sexual behaviours. So it's a whole, kind of landscape here. I think the reason I use the word dependency for the porn and addiction for the sex, although that might include porn, is kind of based on the analogy of alcohol. So somebody can be alcohol dependent without being an alcoholic. Okay, depending on how you use that term. I use the term alcoholic for somebody that's addicted to alcohol. Now, I would say somebody that's an alcoholic is going to have a lifelong craving for alcohol. They can control that, and they can manage that, and they can find ways to live a fulfilled and happy life, dry and free from alcohol. But their issue is a craving for alcohol, or a risk of a return to that craving from alcohol. Alcohol dependency is just where your body gets used to functioning with a certain amount of alcohol on board, and if that alcohol is removed, then your body oh, no, I could go into this in lots of detail because it's one of my subjects, but basically the body goes into a shock state. So somebody withdraws from alcohol when they're alcohol dependent, then they're at risk of seizures, they'll shake, they'll sweat, all those kind of things. That's alcohol dependency. Now, often and usually the two go together, okay? But in theory, what you could do is you could take somebody off the street and kidnap them and force feed them increasing amounts of alcohol until they're alcohol dependent, and then withdraw the alcohol and see what happens to them. But that would be not a very nice thing to do. I think you'd probably find yourself on the wrong side of the law for a number of offences if you did that. But just theoretically, if you did that, they would become alcohol dependent because you made them alcohol dependent. But afterwards, they would probably go back to the same drinking levels that they did before, or more likely, after that kind of experience, you'd probably put them off alcohol for life. They probably wouldn't want alcohol. They'd probably be quite aversive to it. So that's the difference between addiction and dependence. So somebody that's an addict can have 20 detoxes, as they're called. Detox is where you medically safely withdraw somebody from alcohol when they're alcohol dependent. So an addict can have 20 detoxes and then relapse and go back to it, and relapse and go back to it. And that's why people think that detox facilities are the be-all and end-all of alcohol treatment, whereas actually they're just a small part of it. So it's a part of it that kind of stops people from dying, but it's treating the dependency. It's not treating the addiction. Now, in order to treat the addiction, sometimes you also have to treat the dependency to get people safely sober so that they can maintain that sobriety. But if you do nothing else, no other interventions, no therapy, no 12-step groups, no support, no guidance, and you just literally detox people, they're just going to go back to drinking again if they're alcoholic, as in alcohol addicted. So dependent is a physiological thing. It's something that happens to the body, and the brain being part of the body. So that's where the porn dependency would come in. And addiction is more of a lots of people would argue there's a physical component to addiction, and I would agree. I think that there is there are physical things going on as well, but addiction is much more about emotion. It's much more about behavior than just a physical thing. It's not a primarily physical thing. So I hope that makes sense, and I hope and I really hope you that this video gets kind of shared quite widely, because I want to get this message of the dangers of porn use out to men, young men particularly, who are starting out on their masturbatory career. This is the time for them to be aware, and then people can make choices. People are educated. Well, having said that, I think there are. I'm not for prohibition, because prohibition never works with anything. And I'm not against controls, but essentially, as things stand, it's a free country, and what people do with their private parts is their own business. But I'm all for avoiding people pain and misery. So I would like to see people, first and foremost, people educated so they know the choices that they're making before they get into something like dependency, where where it really is. You still do have a choice in dependency, but it's very, very difficult to exercise that choice. So there you go. The difference between porn dependency and sex addiction. And sex addiction does exist, my friends. It really does, and it's serious. It's not fun. And people that have sex addiction and people that have porn dependency deserve help. They deserve the right kind of help and the right kind of information. Rangimarie.